He gave his last bowl of soup to a stranger shivering in the snow, not knowing his daughter would go hungry that night, but when she knocked on his door the next morning, everything he thought he knew about struggle was about to change forever. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story, and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story too. The fluorescent lights above the warehouse floor buzzed like angry wasps, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow that made even the youngest workers look older than their years. Marcus Chen stood at Station 12, his hands moving with the mechanical precision of someone who had counted inventory in his sleep, his back aching from 16 hours of lifting, sorting, cataloging. The digital clock on the wall read 11:47 p.m., and every minute felt like it was dragging its feet through quicksand. His supervisor, a man whose belly strained against his company polo and whose breath always smelled like stale coffee and disappointment, walked past without acknowledgement. Marcus had been invisible here for 5 years, just another pair of hands moving boxes from point A to point B, another name on a timesheet that got filed away and forgotten. But invisible was fine. Invisible meant steady, and steady meant Emma had a roof over her head and food in her stomach most of the time. The final whistle blew, sharp and merciless, cutting through the warehouse noise like a blade. Marcus stripped off his work gloves, his hands pale and cramped beneath, calloused in all the wrong places from gripping cardboard and plastic day after day. He grabbed his jacket from the hook-a-thin windbreaker that had seen better decades and stepped into the December night. The cold hit him like a slap across the face, sharp and unforgiving. Snow had been falling for hours, the kind of wet, heavy flakes that soaked through everything and turned city streets into a gray slush that clung to your boots and never quite came clean. Marcus pulled his jacket tighter, but it was like trying to hold back the ocean with a paper towel. The bus stop was 3 blocks away, and he walked quickly, his breath forming clouds that disappeared as soon as they touched the air. The apartment building where he and Emma lived squatted against the skyline like a tired old man who had given up trying to stand straight. The brick was the color of dried blood, and half the windows had cracks that had been there so long they'd become part of the architecture. The heating barely worked, the elevator hadn't functioned since Emma was 4, and the neighbors kept to themselves with the kind of careful politeness that came from people who had learned not to get too attached to anything. Marcus climbed 4 flights of stairs, his legs heavy with exhaustion, each step echoing in the stairwell like a countdown. By the time he reached his door, his lungs burned and his hands shook as he fumbled with the keys. The hallway smelled like boiled cabbage and something else, something sour and defeated that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. He turned the key and stepped inside, immediately hit by the warmth that Emma always managed to coax from their ancient radiator and the smell of the vanilla candle she'd bought him for Father's Day with money she'd saved from her allowance. The living room was tiny, barely big enough for the second-hand couch and the coffee table that wobbled no matter how many folded napkins he wedged under its legs. But Emma had made it home, with her drawings taped to every available surface, her books stacked in neat piles, her homework spread across the table like she was running a small corporation from their apartment. "Daddy!" Her voice cut through his exhaustion like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Emma looked up from where she was bent over a math worksheet, her dark hair falling in waves around her face, her eyes bright with the kind of energy that only 7-year-olds possessed at midnight. She wore pajamas covered in tiny rockets, and her feet were tucked under her in a way that made her look impossibly small. Marcus felt his chest tighten with something that wasn't quite guilt but wasn't quite relief either. She should have been asleep hours ago, but he knew she waited up for him every night, no matter how many times he told her not to. Emma had developed a fierce independence since her mother left 2 years ago, but she still needed to see his face before she could rest, still needed to know that he had made it home safe. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, dropping his jacket on the back of a chair and crossing to where she sat. He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. "You should be in bed." "I finished my homework," she said, holding up the worksheet with pride. "Mrs. Patterson says I'm getting really good at multiplication." Her smile was missing a front tooth, and the gap made her look younger and older at the same time, younger because of the innocence in her eyes, older because of the way she had learned to take care of herself. Marcus glanced at the problem she'd solved, each number written with the careful precision of someone who understood that details mattered. "These look perfect, Em. You're smarter than your old man." She giggled, a sound that always made something loosen in his chest. "Daddy, you're not old. Mr. Henderson downstairs is old. You're just tired." Tired. The word didn't begin to cover it. Marcus felt like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, like every day was a battle to keep their small life from falling apart completely. But Emma didn't need to know that. Emma needed to believe that everything was under control, that her father was strong enough to handle whatever came their way. "Are you hungry?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Emma was always hungry these days, growing like a weed, her clothes getting too small before he could afford to replace them. "A little," she said, which meant a lot. Emma had learned not to ask for things they couldn't afford, had learned to make herself smaller so he didn't have to worry as much. It broke his heart in ways he couldn't name. Marcus walked to the kitchen, a space so small he could touch both walls with his arms outstretched. The refrigerator hummed and wheezed like an old man with breathing problems, and when he opened it, the light flickered before settling into a weak yellow glow. Inside, there was a carton of milk that would probably last another day, some leftover rice from 3 nights ago that he wasn't sure was still good, and a single can of chicken noodle soup that he'd been saving for exactly this moment. He stared at the can for a long moment, doing mental math that always came up short. Payday was still 3 days away, and his last $20 had gone to Emma's school lunch account yesterday. The soup was meant to last them until Friday, when his paycheck would hit and he could buy groceries again. But Emma was growing, and she'd barely eaten anything at school lunch because she'd given half her sandwich to a kid who'd forgotten his money. Marcus grabbed the can and opened it with the ancient can opener that required more force than it should have. The soup was thin, more broth than substance, but it would fill her up and give her something warm before bed. He poured it into their one good Poto wedding gift from his grandmother that had somehow survived everything else falling apart and turned on the burner. While the soup heated, he sat beside Emma at the table, helping her pack up her homework and listening to her tell him about her day. She talked about her friend Jessica, who had gotten new shoes with lights in them, and about how she'd helped the teacher clean the chalkboard, and about the book she was reading about a girl who found a secret garden. Emma's world was still full of possibilities, still bright with the kind of hope that came from not yet understanding how hard life could be. The soup began to bubble, and Marcus stirred it carefully, making sure it heated evenly. The smell filled the apartment, not quite homemade, but warm and comforting in its familiarity. He ladled it into Emma's favorite bowl, the one with the faded flowers around the rim that had belonged to his mother. "Here you go, princess," he said, setting the bowl in front of her with a spoon and a napkin. "Careful, it's hot." Emma looked up at him with those dark eyes that saw too much. "What about you, Daddy? Aren't you eating?" Marcus felt the lie form in his throat, smooth and practiced. "I grabbed something at work," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "You eat up." She studied his face for a moment, and he wondered if she could see through him the way children sometimes could. But then she smiled and picked up her spoon, blowing gently on the soup before taking a small sip. Her face lit up with satisfaction, and Marcus felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "It's good," she said, taking another spoonful. "Thank you, Daddy." "You're welcome, sweetheart." Marcus watched her eat, memorizing the way she held her spoon, the way she closed her eyes when she tasted something she liked, the way she unconsciously swung her feet under the table. These were the moments that made everything else worth it, the double shifts, the aching back, the constant worry about money. Emma was his anchor, his reason for getting up every morning and fighting through another day. When she finished, she carried her bowl to the sink like she always did, standing on her tiptoes to rinse it out. Marcus helped her brush her teeth and tucked her into bed, reading her a chapter from the library book about the secret garden. Her eyelids grew heavy as he read, and by the time he closed the book, she was already drifting off to sleep. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. "I love you too, Em." More than all the stars in the sky. He kissed her forehead and turned off the light, leaving her door cracked open the way she liked it. In the living room, he collapsed onto the couch, finally allowing himself to feel the full weight of his exhaustion. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since his lunch break 12 hours ago, but the sound felt distant and unimportant. Marcus closed his eyes and was just beginning to drift off when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw a text from Mrs. Garcia, the elderly woman who lived 2 floors down. Her arthritis had been acting up lately, and she had trouble getting to the pharmacy to pick up her medications. "Marcus, honey, I hate to bother you, but would it be possible for you to pick up my prescription tomorrow? I'll pay you back for the bus fare. The snow is too much for these old bones." He stared at the message for a moment, then typed back quickly. "Of course, Mrs. Garcia. I can go tonight if the pharmacy is still open." Her response came immediately. "Bless you, dear, they're open until midnight. The prescription is under Maria Garcia." Marcus checked the time: 11:35 p.m. If he hurried, he could make it to the 24-hour pharmacy, 6 blocks away before they closed. He pulled on his jacket and boots, grabbed his keys, and stepped back into the cold night. The walk to the pharmacy took longer than usual because of the snow, which was still falling steadily, turning the sidewalks into an obstacle course of slush and ice. Marcus kept his head down, his hands buried deep in his pockets, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. The streets were mostly empty except for the occasional taxi or delivery truck, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. The pharmacy was a small, independent place that had somehow survived the invasion of chain stores, probably because it stayed open later than anywhere else in the neighborhood. The neon sign buzzed and flickered, and through the windows, Marcus could see the pharmacist working behind the counter, a tired-looking man with glasses that reflected the harsh fluorescent lights. As Marcus approached the entrance, he noticed someone sitting on the bench outside. At first, he thought it might be someone waiting for a ride, but as he got closer, he realized it was a woman huddled against the cold, her thin jacket providing little protection against the wind. She was shivering so violently that her whole body seemed to vibrate, and her lips had taken on a bluish tint that made Marcus's chest tighten with concern. She looked to be in her 30s, with dark hair that hung in damp strands around her face. Her clothes were worn, and mismatched a pair of jeans with holes in the knees, sneakers that had seen better years, and a jacket that might have been warm once, but now looked like it had given up the fight against the elements. Her hands were wrapped around her knees, and she was rocking slightly, trying to generate warmth through movement. Marcus stopped, his hand on the pharmacy door. He could go inside, get Mrs. Garcia's prescription, and be home in 20 minutes. The woman would probably figure something out. There were shelters, weren't there? Places for people to go when they had nowhere else? But even as he thought it, he knew he couldn't just walk past her. Not when she looked like she might freeze to death before morning. "Excuse me," he said, his voice gentle. "Are you okay?" The woman looked up, and Marcus saw that her eyes were dark and wide, with a kind of exhaustion that went deeper than just being tired. There was something else there, too, a pride that was trying to hold itself together despite everything falling apart around it. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice was shaking as much as her body. "Just waiting for someone." Marcus glanced around the empty street, then back at her. "It's pretty cold out here. The pharmacy has a little waiting area inside if you want to get warm." She shook her head quickly. "I don't want to bother anyone. I'm okay, really." But she wasn't okay. Marcus could see that as clearly as he could see the snow falling around them. Her shivering was getting worse, and he noticed that her fingernails were starting to look blue. He thought about Emma, safe and warm in her bed, and something inside him made a decision before his mind could catch up. "Wait here," he said. "I'll be right back." He went inside and quickly picked up Mrs. Garcia's prescription, paying the copay with the last few dollars in his wallet. But instead of heading straight home, he stopped at the small deli section in the back of the pharmacy. They sold soup the same kind he'd made for Emma earlier, the kind that came in cans and wasn't fancy but was warm and filling. The pharmacy worker, a teenager with tired eyes and a name tag that read, Kyle, looked at him with mild curiosity as Marcus approached the counter with the can. "Could you heat this up for me?" Marcus asked. "I know it's not really a restaurant, but—" "No problem," Kyle said, taking the can without question. "Happens more than you'd think. People need warm food when it's cold like this." While Kyle heated the soup, Marcus grabbed a plastic spoon and some napkins. He thought about the $23.16 in his checking account, about the groceries he couldn't buy until Friday, about Emma asking for new shoes because hers had holes that let in the rain. But he also thought about the woman outside, about the way she was trying so hard to maintain her dignity even while her body betrayed her need. Kyle handed him the soup in a disposable bowl with a plastic lid. "Stay warm out there," he said. Marcus nodded and headed back outside. The woman was still there, still shivering, still trying to convince herself that she was fine. She looked up when he approached, and her eyes widened when she saw what he was carrying. "I thought you might be hungry," Marcus said, holding out the soup. "It's not much, but it's warm." The woman stared at the bowl like it was some kind of mirage. "I can't take that," she said. But her voice was weaker now, and Marcus could see the hunger in her eyes fighting against her pride. "My daughter already ate." Marcus lied, the words coming easier than they should have. "I was just going to throw it away." It was a kindness wrapped in deception, a way to let her accept help without feeling like charity. The woman looked at him for a long moment, and he could see the internal battle playing out across her fascination versus pride, survival versus dignity. Finally, she reached out and took the bowl with trembling hands. The warmth seemed to flow through her fingers like electricity, and she closed her eyes for a moment, just feeling the heat against her palms. "Thank you," she whispered, and when she opened her eyes, there were tears there that caught the light from the pharmacy sign. "You don't know what this means." Marcus felt something twist in his chest. "What's your name?" "Elena," she said, carefully removing the lid and breathing in the steam that rose from the soup. "Elena Rodriguez." "I'm Marcus," he said. "Marcus Chen." Elena nodded, then carefully took a spoonful of the soup. Her eyes closed again as she tasted it, and a soft sound escaped her lips, not quite a sigh, not quite a sob, but something in between. She ate slowly, savoring each bite like it was the most important meal she'd ever had. Marcus watched her for a moment, then realized he should probably give her some privacy. "I hope things get better for you, Elena," he said. "Wait," she said, looking up at him with those dark eyes. "Why did you do this?" "You don't even know me." Marcus thought about it for a moment, thought about Emma safe in her bed, about Mrs. Garcia trusting him with her prescription, about all the small kindnesses that had kept him going when everything else seemed to be falling apart. "Because someone should," he said simply. "Because you're sitting here in the snow and you needed help, and I happen to have soup." Elena stared at him like he'd said something profound instead of stating the obvious. Most people would have walked right past. "Most people aren't single parents," Marcus said, and then immediately wondered why he'd shared that detail. "When you're responsible for someone else, you learn to notice when people need help." Elena nodded slowly, understanding something in his words that went deeper than the surface. "You have a child?" "A daughter. Emma. She's 7. He found himself smiling despite the cold, despite the worry about money, despite everything. "She's probably the smartest kid in her class, though I might be a little biased." "I bet she's lucky to have you," Elena said, and there was something in her voice, a weight, a sadness that made Marcus wonder what her story was. "I'm the lucky one," he said. And he meant it. Elena took another spoonful of soup, and Marcus could see color starting to return to her cheeks. "I should let you get home to her," she said. "Thank you again, Marcus. I won't forget this." "Take care of yourself, Elena," he said, then turned and began the long walk home. The snow was falling harder now, and by the time Marcus reached his apartment building, his jacket was soaked through, and his fingers were numb. He climbed the 4 flights of stairs more slowly than usual, his body finally acknowledging the full weight of the day's exhaustion. Inside the apartment, everything was exactly as he'd left. Emma's homework neatly stacked on the table, her bowl washed and drying by the sink, the vanilla candle burned down to almost nothing. He checked on Emma, who was sleeping soundly with her arms wrapped around the stuffed elephant he'd bought her for her 5th birthday, and then returned to the living room. Marcus sat on the couch and pulled off his boots, his stomach growling loudly in the quiet apartment. He opened the refrigerator again, staring at the nearly empty shelves, at the carton of milk and the questionable leftover rice. He could eat the rice, probably. It might be okay. Or he could wait until morning and have coffee for breakfast, then figure something out for lunch. But as he stood there in the dim light of the refrigerator, all he could think about was Elena's face when she'd taken that first sip of soup. The gratitude in her eyes, the way she'd held the bowl like it was precious, the tears that she'd tried to hide. Marcus had given away his last meal, and somehow he felt fuller than he had in weeks. He closed the refrigerator and made himself a cup of tea with the last tea bag in the box, letting the warm liquid fill the empty space in his stomach. Tomorrow he would figure out breakfast for Emma. Maybe he could ask Mrs. Garcia if she had any extra bread, or maybe he could stop by the church food pantry before work. Emma would never know that her father had gone to bed hungry, would never know that he'd given away their only can of soup to a stranger shivering in the snow. As Marcus finally settled into bed, pulling the thin blanket up to his chin, he thought about the choices that defined a person. He could have walked past Elena, could have told himself that he had his own problems to worry about. He could have bought the soup for himself and let her figure out her own solution. But those weren't the choices that felt right, weren't the choices that would let him sleep peacefully, knowing that Emma was growing up watching him. He wanted his daughter to understand that kindness wasn't something you offered only when it was convenient, only when you had plenty to spare. Kindness was something you gave, especially when it cost you something, especially when it meant sacrificing your own comfort for someone else's need. If Emma learned nothing else from him, he wanted her to learn that. The wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the building, a radiator clanked and hissed. Marcus closed his eyes and tried not to think about the empty refrigerator, tried not to calculate how many hours until payday, tried not to worry about whether Elena had found somewhere warm to spend the night. Instead, he thought about Emma's smile when she'd tasted the soup, about the way she'd thanked him for something as simple as a warm meal. He thought about Mrs. Garcia trusting him with her prescription, about the small ways people took care of each other in a world that often felt too big and too cold. He thought about Elena's eyes, about the dignity she'd maintained even when she was shivering and hungry, about the strength it took to keep going when everything seemed stacked against you. And as sleep finally began to take him, Marcus Chen felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The quiet satisfaction that came from knowing he'd done the right thing, even when the right thing was hard, even when it cost him the last thing he had to give. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new worries, new choices to make. But tonight, he'd chosen kindness, and that was enough. In her bedroom, Emma stirred in her sleep, unconsciously reaching for the warmth of her blanket. She was safe, she was fed, and she was loved by a father who would give away his last meal to help a stranger in need. She didn't know it yet, but that was perhaps the most valuable gift he could give her, not just security or comfort, but the example of what it meant to be human in a world that sometimes forgot how to care. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the city in white, covering the harsh edges of the world with something soft and clean. And in apartment 4B, a single father slept the deep sleep of someone who had emptied himself in service of others, trusting that somehow, some way, there would be enough tomorrow to begin again. The morning came gray and reluctant, as if the sky itself was nursing a hangover from the previous night's storm. Marcus woke to the sound of Emma humming in the kitchen, tuneless but cheerful melody that somehow managed to make their cramped apartment feel larger. He blinked at the alarm clock, its red numbers glowing 7:23 a.m., and groaned as his body reminded him of yesterday's 16-hour shift and the restless sleep that had followed. His stomach growled immediately, a hollow ache that he'd grown accustomed to ignoring. Coffee would help, if they had any left. Maybe some toast, if the bread hadn't gone stale. He pushed himself out of bed, his joints protesting like old machinery that needed oil, and shuffled toward the kitchen in yesterday's clothes. Emma was standing on the step stool they kept by the counter, carefully spooning cereal into a bowl. She'd already gotten dressed for school, a purple sweater that was getting too small for her, and jeans with patches on both knees that she'd insisted on decorating with fabric markers. Her hair was braided in a way that suggested she'd attempted it herself, with several strands escaping in directions that defied gravity. "Morning, Daddy," she said without looking up, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration as she poured milk with the careful precision of someone who understood that spills meant less milk for later. "Morning, sweetheart," Marcus said, reaching over to smooth down one of her rebellious cowlicks. "You're up early." "I wanted to make sure there was enough time for breakfast," she said, and something in her tone made Marcus's chest tighten. Emma had learned to be practical about things like time and resources, had learned to plan ahead in ways that 7-year-olds shouldn't have to think about. Marcus opened the refrigerator and stared at its nearly empty shelves. The milk carton was lighter than it should have been, the leftover rice had developed a questionable smell overnight, and the bread on the counter felt stale when he pressed it gently. His last $20 had gone to Mrs. Garcia's prescription copay, and payday was still 2 days away. "Dad?" Emma's voice was small. "Are you going to eat something?" He turned to find her watching him with those dark eyes that seemed to see everything. She'd finished her cereal, and was holding the bowl with both hands, as if protecting it from some invisible threat. "I'll grab something at work," Marcus lied, the words coming easily now after years of practice. "You finish up so we can get you to school." Emma nodded, but she continued to watch him with that careful attention that made him feel transparent. She rinsed her bowl in the sink, standing on her tiptoes to reach the faucet, then gathered her backpack and homework folder with the methodical efficiency of someone twice her age. The walk to Emma's school took 15 minutes through streets that looked different, in daylightless, mysterious, more worn down. The snow from the night before had turned to slush that splashed up from passing cars and soaked through the holes in Marcus's work boots. Emma chattered about her spelling test and the art project they were starting in class, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. At the school entrance, Marcus knelt down to zip up Emma's jacket and tuck her scarf more securely around her neck. "Have a good day, okay? Mrs. Patterson's going to love that homework you finished last night." "Will you be here to pick me up?" Emma asked, adjusting her backpack straps. "I'll try," Marcus said, which they both knew meant probably not. "If not, you know the drill. Wait in the office until I get here, or until Mrs. Chen can walk you home." Emma nodded seriously. Mrs. Chen was their downstairs neighbor, a grandmother whose own children lived across the country, and who had taken to watching Emma when Marcus's schedule ran long. It was an arrangement built on mutual need and unspoken understanding. Mrs. Chen got company, Emma got supervision, and Marcus got the peace of mind that came from knowing his daughter wasn't sitting alone in an empty apartment. "I love you, kiddo," Marcus said, kissing the top of her head. "Love you too, Daddy. Don't work too hard." Marcus watched her walk through the school doors, her small figure disappearing into the crowd of children and backpacks and winter coats. Then he turned and began the long walk to the bus stop, his empty stomach gnawing at him like a constant reminder of all the things he couldn't provide. The warehouse was already humming with activity when Marcus arrived, workers moving with the mechanical precision of people who had done the same job so many times it had become muscle memory. He clocked in and took his position at Station 12, letting the familiar rhythm of scanning, sorting, and stacking wash over him like meditation. His supervisor, a man named Patterson, whose main qualification seemed to be his ability to make everyone around him feel smaller, walked past around 10 a.m. with his clipboard and perpetual scowl. "Chen," he said without stopping, "corporate wants those electronics shipments processed by lunch. No delays." Marcus nodded and picked up his pace, ignoring the way his stomach cramped with hunger. He'd learned to work through worse things than an empty belly through migraines and pulled muscles and the kind of exhaustion that made his vision blur around the edges. This was just another challenge to push through, another test of how much he could endure for Emma's sake. By noon, the electronic shipment was processed and logged, but Marcus skipped his lunch break. He told himself it was because he wanted to get ahead on the afternoon deliveries, but really it was because sitting in the break room watching other people eat their sandwiches and leftover pasta felt like a special kind of torture. Instead, he went outside to the loading dock, where the air was cold but clean, and called to check on Mrs. Garcia. Her arthritis medication seemed to be helping, she said, and she insisted on telling him about her grandson's acceptance to community college and her neighbor's new kitten. Marcus listened with half his attention, while the other half calculated and recalculated the days until payday, the money in his checking account, the bills that were due, and the groceries they needed. It was nearly 2 p.m. when Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Emma's school. His heart jumped into his throat. The school only called when something was wrong, when Emma was sick or hurt or in trouble. "Mr. Chen, this is Mrs. Patterson. Emma seems to be feeling under the weather. Could you pick her up when convenient? She's resting in the nurse's office." Marcus stared at the message, his chest tightening with worry and frustration in equal measure. Emma had been fine that morning, bright and energetic and ready for her spelling test. But she was also 7 years old and had learned not to complain when she didn't feel well, had learned to push through discomfort because she didn't want to worry him. He found Patterson and explained the situation, watching the man's face go through the predictable sequence of annoyance, calculation, and reluctant acceptance. Missing work meant missing pay, but leaving a sick child at school wasn't an option. "Be back tomorrow," Patterson said finally, "and make sure it doesn't become a habit." Marcus nodded and grabbed his jacket, practically running to the bus stop. The ride to Emma's school felt like it took hours, even though it was only 20 minutes. He kept checking his phone, as if a new message might appear with more details about what was wrong, what had happened, whether she was really okay. The school nurse, a kind woman with gray hair and gentle hands, met him at the office entrance. "She's probably just tired," she said, leading him down the hallway. "Maybe coming down with something. Her temperature is slightly elevated, but nothing dramatic." Emma was curled up on the small cot in the nurse's office, looking impossibly small under the thin blanket. Her cheeks were flushed, and when she saw Marcus, she struggled to sit up. "Daddy," she said, her voice hoarse, "I don't feel good." Marcus sat on the edge of the cot and pressed his hand to her forehead. She was warm, not burning with fever, but definitely warmer than she should be. "What hurts, sweetheart?" "My tummy," she said, wrapping her arms around her middle. "And my head feels funny." The nurse handed Marcus a thermometer reading and some paperwork. "Keep her hydrated and let her rest. If the fever goes up or she gets worse, you might want to call her pediatrician." Marcus nodded, signing the forms and helping Emma gather her backpack. As they walked to the bus stop, she leaned against him heavily, her usual chatter replaced by the kind of quiet that only came when she really didn't feel well. On the bus ride home, Emma dozed against his shoulder while Marcus stared out the window and worried. Children got sick, it was normal, expected, part of growing up. But normal childhood illnesses required things like pediatrician visits and prescription medications and time off work, all of which cost money he didn't have. His insurance was basic at best, with a deductible that might as well have been $1 million for all the good it did him. Back at the apartment, Marcus helped Emma into her pajamas and tucked her into bed with every pillow and blanket they owned. She fell asleep almost immediately, her breathing steady but slightly congested. He sat beside her for a long time, watching the rise and fall of her chest and trying to calculate how long he could afford to stay home if she didn't get better. The knock on the door came at 4:17 p.m., according to the digital clock on the microwave. Marcus had been dozing in the chair beside Emma's bed, exhausted from worry and the adrenaline crash that followed any crisis involving his daughter. The sound was soft but persistent, not the aggressive pounding of bill collectors or angry neighbors, but something more tentative, Marcus rubbed his eyes and padded to the front door, checking the peephole out of habit. What he saw made him blink and look again, certain that exhaustion was playing tricks on his vision. A woman stood in the hallway, but not just any woman. She was tall and elegant, wearing a charcoal gray coat that looked like it cost more than Marcus made in a month. Her dark hair was styled in a way that suggested professional attention, and she carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that came from never having to worry about whether she belonged somewhere. It took Marcus a full 30 seconds to recognize her. Elena Rodriguez stood outside his door, transformed so completely from the shivering woman he'd met the night before that she might have been a different person entirely. The tattered clothes and desperate hunger were gone, replaced by polished shoes and makeup applied with expert precision. But the eyes were the same, dark and intelligent and somehow familiar. Marcus opened the door slowly, his brain struggling to process what he was seeing. Elena? She smiled, and it was the same smile from the night before, though now it was framed by lipstick and confidence instead of exhaustion and desperation. Hello, Marcus. I hope I'm not disturbing you. How did you? Marcus looked past her into the hallway, as if expecting to see cameras or some other explanation for why a woman who had been homeless 12 hours ago was now standing at his door looking like she'd stepped out of a business magazine. May I come in? Elena asked gently. I know this must be confusing. I'd like to explain. Marcus hesitated, acutely aware of the apartment behind him, the cramped rooms, the second-hand furniture, the lingering smell of the vanilla candle that couldn't quite mask the mustiness of old carpet and poor ventilation. This woman clearly came from a different world, one with marble countertops and wine cellars and cars that didn't require prayer to start on cold mornings. But something in her expression reminded him of the night before, of the gratitude in her eyes when he'd handed her that bowl of soup. Despite the transformation, despite the questions multiplying in his head like algebra problems, she was still the same person he'd helped. Okay, he said, stepping aside to let her in. Elena entered carefully, her heels clicking softly on the linoleum floor. She looked around the apartment with the same careful attention she'd shown the night before, but this time there was no judgment in her assessment, only observation. Is Emma here? She asked. Your daughter? She's sleeping, Marcus said, unconsciously lowering his voice. She came home sick from school. Elena's expression shifted immediately, concern replacing the careful composure. Nothing serious, I hope? Just a low fever. Probably a bug going around school. Marcus gestured toward the couch. You can sit if you want. I have to warn you, though I'm completely lost here. Last night you were. He stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence without sounding accusatory. Last night I was exactly who you thought I was, Elena said, settling onto the couch with fluid grace. Cold, hungry, and desperate. But I wasn't homeless, Marcus. I was conducting research. Marcus remained standing, his arms crossed over his chest. Research? Elena reached into her pursy leather bag that probably cost more than his monthly rent and pulled out a business card. She handed it to him, and Marcus read it twice before the words sank in. Elena Rodriguez, Chief Executive Officer, Rodriguez Holdings. You're a CEO, Marcus said flatly. I am. Rodriguez Holdings is a food distribution company. We supply restaurants, grocery stores, institutional kitchens. We're quite large, actually. Marcus stared at the card, then at Elena, then back at the card. And you were sitting outside a pharmacy in the snow because I was making a documentary, Elena said, her voice quiet but steady, about homelessness, about food insecurity, about what it really means to be invisible in this country. My production team was filming from across the street with telephoto lenses. The idea was to document how people respond when they encounter someone in need. The words hit Marcus like cold water. You were filming me? We were filming the situation, Elena corrected quickly. But Marcus, what you did, no one else stopped. We filmed for 3 hours before you came along, and dozens of people walked past. Some crossed the street to avoid me, others pretended not to see me. But you stopped, and you gave me food from your own mouth. Marcus set the business card on the coffee table with more force than necessary. So this was all some kind of social experiment? You were testing people to see how they'd react to a fake homeless person? It wasn't fake, Elena said, and there was something sharp in her voice now, something that cut through the polished exterior. The cold was real, the hunger was real, the desperation was real. Just because I have money in the bank doesn't mean I wasn't genuinely suffering in that moment. Marcus began pacing the small room, his hands clenched into fists. Do you have any idea how patronizing this is? You put on some old clothes and sat outside for a few hours, and now you think you understand what it's like to be poor? No, Elena said firmly. I don't think 3 hours gives me any real understanding of poverty. But it gave me enough understanding to recognize something extraordinary when I saw it. What's that supposed to mean? Elena stood up, matching his intensity with calm determination. It means that you gave away what might have been your last meal to help a stranger. It means that when I researched you afterward, yes, I looked you up, Marcus discovered that you work 16-hour days to support your daughter alone. It means that despite having every reason to be bitter and closed off, you chose kindness. Marcus stopped pacing. You researched me? I had to know who you were. After what you did, I couldn't just walk away. Elena moved closer, her voice softer now. Marcus, I've spent the last 15 years building a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I've shaken hands with senators and signed deals with Fortune 500 companies. But last night, you taught me something about humanity that all my success couldn't buy. Which was what? That generosity isn't about how much you have, it's about how much you're willing to give up. The apartment fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic and the wheeze of the old radiator. Marcus sank into the chair across from the couch, suddenly feeling older than his 32 years. Why are you here, Elena? He asked finally. Because I want to pay you back. I don't want your money. I'm not offering you money, Elena said, sitting back down. I'm offering you something else entirely. From her purse, she pulled out a manila folder and set it on the coffee table beside her business card. Rodriguez Holdings is expanding. We're opening a new distribution center here in the city, and we need a logistics coordinator. Someone to manage inventory, oversee shipping schedules, coordinate with our drivers and warehouse staff. Marcus glanced at the folder but didn't touch it. I don't have experience in food distribution. You have 5 years of warehouse experience. You understand inventory management, shipping logistics, and quality control. You're reliable, hard-working, and you clearly understand the value of treating people with respect. Elena paused. The position comes with full health benefits, a 401k, and a salary that's approximately 3 times what you're making now. The number she mentioned made Marcus's head spin. 3 times his current salary would mean Emma could have new clothes when she needed them, medical care without crushing debt, maybe even savings for college. It would mean not lying awake at night calculating grocery money and rent payments. It would mean breathing room. Why me? Marcus asked. You could hire someone with an MBA, someone with actual experience in your industry. Because MBAs don't give away their last bowl of soup to shivering strangers, Elena replied. Because experience can be taught, but character can't. Because I need someone I can trust, and you've already proven that you can be trusted with the most important things. Marcus picked up the folder and opened it slowly. The job description was detailed and comprehensive, outlining responsibilities that sounded both challenging and achievable. The salary figure was written in black ink at the bottom of the page, and seeing it in writing made his hands shake slightly. This is too much, he said quietly. It's exactly what the position is worth, Elena replied. Marcus, this isn't charity. This is a job offer. I need someone good at this role, and I believe you can be excellent at it. The fact that it also helps you and Emma is just a bonus. From Emma's bedroom came the soft sound of coughing, followed by a small, sleepy voice calling, "Daddy?" Marcus set the folder aside and stood up. I need to check on her. Of course, Elena said. Take your time. Emma was sitting up in bed, her hair messy from sleep and her cheeks still flushed with fever. I heard voices, she said. her voice still hoarse. "Is someone here? Remember the lady from the restaurant? The one who helped us that night?" Marcus sat on the edge of the bed and felt her forehead. Still warm, but not worse. "She came to visit." Emma's eyes widened. "The fancy lady? She's here?" "She's in the living room. How are you feeling, sweetheart?" "Better, I think. My tummy doesn't hurt as much." Emma tried to smooth down her hair. "Do I look okay?" "I don't want to look sick in front of the fancy lady." Marcus smiled and kissed her forehead. "You look beautiful, but you should rest some more. Can I meet her? Just for a minute?" Marcus hesitated. Elena had asked about Emma, had seemed genuinely concerned about her illness. And Emma had so few opportunities to meet new people, especially people who might serve as positive examples of what was possible in the world. "Okay," he said, "but just for a minute, and then you're going back to bed." Emma nodded solemnly and let Marcus help her into her bathrobe and slippers. They walked to the living room together, Emma holding his hand and standing slightly behind him in a display of shyness that was rare for her. Elena looked up when they entered, and her face lit up with genuine pleasure. "You must be Emma," she said, staying seated so she wouldn't tower over the small girl. "Your father has told me so many wonderful things about you." Emma stepped forward slightly, curiosity overcoming caution. "You're the lady who was at the fancy restaurant." "I am. And you're the girl who was brave enough to dress up like a princess and demand that the world treat you like one." Emma giggled, a sound that made Marcus's chest warm with relief. "Daddy says you helped us that night." "Actually," Elena said, glancing at Marcus, "I think your father helped me much more than I helped you. He taught me something very important about kindness." "Daddy's the kindest person in the whole world," Emma said, matter-of-factly. "He gives me soup even when he's hungry. And he reads me stories even when he's tired, and he never gets mad when I ask too many questions." Elena's eyes met Marcus's over Emma's head, and he saw something there that looked like understanding, like recognition of the daily sacrifices that single parents made without thinking about it. "He sounds like a very good father," Elena said softly. "The best," Emma agreed. Then she yawned, a huge yawn that reminded everyone in the room that she was still recovering from whatever bug had knocked her down. "Back to bed, kiddo," Marcus said, guiding her toward the bedroom. "You need more rest." "Will the fancy lady still be here when I wake up?" Emma asked. Marcus looked at Elena questioningly. She nodded. "I'll be here for a while longer," Elena said. "Rest well, Emma." After Marcus had tucked Emma back into bed and returned to the living room, he found Elena standing by the window, looking out at the street below. The late afternoon light caught the expensive fabric of her coat, highlighting the quality that separated her world from his. "She's remarkable," Elena said without turning around. "Bright and kind and completely unaware of how hard things are for you." "That's the point," Marcus said. "She gets to be a kid for as long as possible." Elena turned to face him. "But she won't be a kid forever. And when she grows up, wouldn't you want her to have opportunities? Options? The chance to pursue whatever dreams she has without worrying about money?" Marcus felt the weight of the job offer like a physical presence in the room. "You're asking me to change everything." "I'm asking you to consider the possibility that everything could change for the better," Elena corrected. "Marcus, I know this is overwhelming. I know you don't trust it, and I understand why, but I'm not going anywhere. This isn't some impulse decision that I'll regret tomorrow." "How do I know that?" Marcus asked. "How do I know this isn't just guilt or some kind of rich person's whim?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer. When she spoke, her voice was softer than before, more vulnerable. "Because I grew up in a neighborhood very much like this one," she said. "Because my mother worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table, and I know what it feels like to go to bed hungry. Because I remember being Emma's age and having to grow up too fast because there was no other choice." Marcus stared at her, trying to reconcile this information with the polished woman standing in his living room. "I built Rodriguez Holdings from nothing," Elena continued. "I started with a food truck and a dream, and I worked 18-hour days for 15 years to get where I am. But somewhere along the way, I forgot what it felt like to really need help. Last night, you reminded me. By giving you soup? By treating me like a human being when I needed it most, Elena said. By choosing to help even when it cost you something. That's not common, Marcus. That's extraordinary. Marcus picked up the folder again, staring at the job description without really reading it. If I took this job, when would I start? Whenever you're ready. We can work around Emma's school schedule, around whatever transition time you need. This is about what works for your family, not what's convenient for my company. And if it doesn't work out? If I'm not good at it? Elena smiled. Then we'll figure out what you are good at and find a different role. Marcus, I'm not hiring you as a favor. I'm hiring you because I believe you'll be excellent at this job. But even if you weren't, I'd rather have someone with your character working for me than someone with perfect credentials and no soul. The apartment fell quiet again, except for the soft sound of Emma's breathing from the bedroom and the distant noise of the city outside. Marcus thought about the warehouse, about Patterson's condescending smirks and the constant worry about money. He thought about Emma asking for new shoes, and him having to explain why they had to wait. He thought about lying awake at night calculating bills and coming up short every time. But he also thought about the risk of leaving something stable for something unknown, about the possibility that this was too good to be true, about what would happen if he trusted Elena and she disappointed him. I need time to think about it, he said finally. Of course, Elena said, standing and gathering her purse. Take all the time you need. My card is there with the job description. Call me when you're ready to talk, or if you have any questions. She moved toward the door, then paused. Marcus, can I ask you something? Sure. What did you eat for dinner last night, after you gave me the soup? Marcus hesitated, not wanting to admit the truth, but unable to lie to her directly. I wasn't that hungry. Elena nodded slowly, understanding more than he'd said. And today? What did you have for lunch? I was busy at work. Right. Elena reached into her purse and pulled out her wallet. Let me give you some money for groceries, for Emma's medicine if she needs it. No, Marcus said quickly, perhaps more sharply than he intended. I told you, I don't want your money. It's not charity, Elena said gently. It's an advance on your first week's salary, if you take the job. And if I don't take the job? Elena smiled. Then consider it payment for the best bowl of soup I've ever had. She set several bills on the coffee table, more money than Marcus had seen in one place in months, and headed for the door before he could object. Think about it, Marcus, she said, her hand on the doorknob. Think about what this could mean for Emma's future. And call me when you're ready. After she left, Marcus stood in the middle of his living room, staring at the money on the table and the job offer beside it. Everything felt surreal, like he'd stepped into someone else's life by mistake. 24 hours ago, his biggest worry had been stretching one can of soup into dinner for Emma. Now he was looking at a job offer that could change everything. Emma called from the bedroom, her voice stronger than it had been earlier. Daddy, can I have some water? Marcus folded the money and put it in his pocket, then went to take care of his daughter. The job offer could wait, Emma couldn't. But as he filled a glass with water and helped her sit up to drink it, he found himself imagining a different future one, where he didn't have to choose between his daughter's needs and his own, where kindness was something he could afford to give without counting the cost. It was a dangerous thing to hope for, but as Emma smiled at him over the rim of her water glass, Marcus thought that maybe, just maybe, it was worth the risk. The money Elena had left sat on Marcus's kitchen table for 3 days like an accusation. He'd counted it twice enough for groceries, Emma's medicine if she needed it, maybe even a small cushion against the next emergency. But every time he looked at it, he felt the weight of obligation pressing against his chest like a stone. Emma had recovered quickly from her fever, bouncing back with the resilience that only children possessed. She'd returned to school with her usual enthusiasm, chattering about multiplication tables and the upcoming science fair. But Marcus noticed the way she looked at the money when she thought he wasn't watching, her 7-year-old mind trying to puzzle out why there were suddenly $20 bills scattered across their table like fallen leaves. "Did you find that money, Daddy?" she'd asked on the second day, her voice careful in the way it got when she was testing dangerous waters. "A friend gave it to me," Marcus had replied, which was technically true, but felt like a lie anyway. "The fancy lady?" "Yes, the fancy lady." Emma had nodded solemnly, as if this explained everything, and gone back to her coloring book. But Marcus could see the questions forming behind her eyes, the same questions that had been keeping him awake at night. On Thursday morning, Marcus arrived at the warehouse to find Patterson waiting by his station with a clipboard, and the expression of a man who'd been looking forward to delivering bad news. "Chen," Patterson said without preamble, "corporate's implementing some cost-cutting measures. We're reducing hours across all shifts, effective immediately." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "What does that mean for me?" "Means your 40 hours just became 30. Maybe less, depending on volume." Patterson made a note on his clipboard with the flourish of someone who enjoyed wielding small amounts of power. "You got a problem with that. There's plenty of people looking for work." 30 hours. Marcus did the math automatically, the way he'd trained himself to calculate the cost of everything: groceries, rent, utilities, Emma's school supplies. 30 hours wouldn't cover their expenses, not even close. They'd been barely scraping by on 40. "When does this start?" Marcus asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Today. You can head home after lunch." Patterson walked away without waiting for a response, leaving Marcus standing alone beside the conveyor belt that had been his anchor for 5 years. The morning crawled by with the peculiar slowness that came from knowing each task might be among the last. Marcus moved through his routine scanning, sorting, stacking, but his mind was elsewhere, calculating and recalculating numbers that refused to add up to anything sustainable. During his lunch break, he sat outside on the loading dock and stared at Elena's business card, which he'd been carrying in his wallet like a talisman. The job offer suddenly felt less like an opportunity and more like a lifeline, but the thought of actually calling the number filled him with a different kind of dread. Marcus had never been good at asking for help. It was a skill he'd never learned, a muscle he'd never developed. Even as a child, when his own father had worked 3 jobs just to keep their family afloat, the message had been clear. You solved your own problems. You carried your own weight. You didn't burden other people with your struggles. His ex-wife, Linda, had thrown those principles back at him during their final fight, the one that had ended with her packing a suitcase in the middle of the night while Emma slept in the next room. "You'll never amount to anything, Marcus," she'd said, her voice cold with a certainty that had cut deeper than any shout. "You think being noble and self-sufficient makes you a man, but it just makes you small. Small job, small apartment, small dreams. That's all you'll ever have." The words had followed him through 2 years of single parenthood, whispered in his ear every time he struggled to pay a bill or had to choose between groceries and rent. They'd shaped his caution, his reluctance to trust that anything good could last, his fear that reaching for more would only prove Linda right. But sitting on that loading dock, watching 18-wheelers lumber past like mechanical dinosaurs, Marcus thought about Emma's face when she'd met Elena. The wonder in her eyes, the easy way she'd accepted that some people lived in a world of fancy restaurants and tailored coats. Emma hadn't inherited his fear of dreaming too big. She still believed in possibilities. Marcus pulled out his phone and stared at Elena's number for a long time before finally dialing. She answered on the second ring. "Elena Rodriguez." "It's Marcus," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Marcus Chen, we met." "I remember," Elena interrupted gently. "How's Emma feeling?" "Better, much better, thank you." Marcus took a breath. "I wanted to talk to you about the job. If the offer is still open." "Of course it is. Are you interested?" Marcus watched a delivery truck navigate the narrow alley, its driver cursing creatively at the tight space. "I need to know more about it." "About what would be expected of me." "Would you like to meet? I could show you the facility, introduce you to some of the team. No pressure, just information." The idea of walking into Elena's world, of seeing her company and meeting her employees, made Marcus's palms sweat. But he thought about Patterson's smirk, About 30 hours of work that wouldn't pay for 40 hours of living. Okay, he said. When? Are you free this afternoon? I know it's short notice, but I'm free. Marcus said, the words tasting bitter because they were true for all the wrong reasons. They arranged to meet at 3 p.m. at the Rodriguez Holdings distribution center on the south side of town. After Marcus hung up, he sat for a moment longer, watching the loading dock activity and trying to convince himself he was making the right choice. The Rodriguez Holdings facility was nothing like the warehouse where Marcus had spent the last 5 years. Where his workplace was all concrete and fluorescent lights and the constant noise of machinery, Elena's distribution center felt like it had been designed by someone who actually cared about the people who worked there. The building was modern but not ostentatious, with large windows that let in natural light and a parking lot that wasn't filled with potholes. The loading docks were organized and clean, the signage was clear and professional, and the whole place hummed with the kind of efficient energy that came from good management. Elena met him at the main entrance, dressed in dark slacks and a cream-colored blouse that managed to look both professional and approachable. She'd traded her CEO coat for something more practical, but she still carried herself with that quiet confidence that made Marcus feel underdressed in his work clothes. "Thank you for coming," she said, extending her hand for a firm handshake. "I know this must feel strange." "Everything about this feels strange," Marcus admitted. Elena smiled. "Good strange or bad strange? I'm not sure yet." She led him through the entrance into a lobby that was clean and well lit, with comfortable seating and walls decorated with photos of the company's community involvement, food drives, scholarship programs, employee recognition events. Marcus recognized the strategy. He'd seen it in every corporate facility he'd ever visited. But something about these photos felt different, more genuine, like they'd been taken by someone who actually cared about the events they documented. Rodriguez Holdings employs about 400 people across 3 facilities, Elena explained as they walked toward the main floor. "This is our largest distribution center. We handle fresh produce, dry goods, frozen foods, basically everything that keeps restaurants and grocery stores stocked." They passed through a set of double doors, and Marcus found himself in a warehouse that was simultaneously familiar and alien. The basic structure was the same as his current workplace: conveyor belts, loading docks, rows of shelving stretching toward the ceiling. But everything here was newer, cleaner, more organized. Workers moved with purpose rather than resignation, and Marcus noticed something that struck him as significant. People were talking to each other. Not just the quick, functional communication of people trying to get through a shift, but actual conversation. The logistics coordinator position would involve overseeing inventory management for this facility, Elena continued, leading him past a group of workers who nodded respectfully as she passed. "You'd work with our purchasing team to ensure we have adequate stock levels, coordinate with drivers and shipping schedules, manage quality control processes." They stopped at a glass-walled office that overlooked the main floor. Through the windows, Marcus could see the entire operation: forklifts moving pallets, workers scanning barcodes, supervisors checking clipboards. It looked like controlled chaos, but he could see the patterns underneath, the systems that kept everything flowing smoothly. "This would be your office," Elena said, opening the door and stepping inside. The office was small but well appointed, with a desk, 2 chairs, and a computer that looked like it had been manufactured sometime in the current decade. A window overlooked the main floor, and Marcus could imagine sitting here, watching the operation, being responsible for keeping it running smoothly. "It's a lot bigger than my current workspace," he said, running his hand along the edge of the desk. "What's your current workspace like?" Marcus thought about Station 12, about the cramped corner where he'd spent 5 years scanning barcodes and moving boxes. "It's not an office." Elena sat down in one of the chairs and gestured for Marcus to take the other. "Tell me about your experience. What does a typical day look like for you?" For the next 20 minutes, Marcus found himself describing his work in more detail than he'd ever articulated before. He talked about inventory systems and shipping schedules, about quality control and efficiency metrics. As he spoke, he realized that he knew more about warehouse operations than he'd given himself credit for. 5 years of paying attention, of solving problems and improving processes, had given him expertise he hadn't recognized. Elena listened without interrupting, asking occasional questions that showed she understood the complexity of what he was describing. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, processing what she'd heard. "You're underemployed," she said finally. "What?" "You're doing work that's beneath your skill level. You understand systems and logistics in a way that most people never develop. You've just been in an environment that doesn't value that understanding." Marcus felt something uncomfortable shift in his chest. "I'm just a warehouse worker." "No," Elena said firmly. "You're a logistics professional who's been working in a warehouse. There's a difference." Before Marcus could respond, there was a knock on the office door. A woman in her 50s poked her head in, her gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and her hands dusted with what looked like flour. "Elena, sorry to interrupt. We've got that shipment from the organic farm coming in early, and I wanted to check the cold storage allocation." "Of course," Elena said, standing. "Marcus, I'd like you to meet Carmen Delgado, our operations manager." "Carmen, this is Marcus Chen. He's considering joining our team as logistics coordinator." Carmen stepped into the office and extended her hand with a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Nice to meet you, Marcus. You have warehouse experience?" 5 years, Marcus said, shaking her hand and noting the firm grip that spoke of someone who wasn't afraid of physical work. "Good. This place runs on people who understand that every detail matters. You start at the bottom and work your way up, or you never really understand how the whole system fits together." Carmen turned to Elena. "Cold storage is at about 70% capacity. We can handle the early shipment if we move some of the produce that's scheduled to ship tomorrow." "Do it," Elena said. "And thanks for checking." After Carmen left, Elena and Marcus continued their tour. They visited the cold storage units, where workers in insulated coats moved quickly through rows of produce and dairy products. They saw the dry goods warehouse, with its towering shelves and computer-controlled inventory system. They watched the loading dock operation, where drivers and warehouse workers coordinated shipments with the kind of practiced efficiency that only came from good training and clear communication. Throughout the tour, Elena introduced Marcus to employees at every level: drivers, warehouse workers, supervisors, office staff. Without exception, they treated Elena with respect rather than deference, and she spoke to each of them with genuine interest in their work and their opinions. "How long have you owned this company?" Marcus asked as they made their way back toward the office. "I founded it 12 years ago," Elena replied. "But I've only owned it in the sense that my name is on the incorporation papers. Everyone here owns it in a way. We have profit sharing, stock options for full-time employees, comprehensive benefits. People work better when they have a stake in the outcome." They ended up back in the potential office, where Elena pulled out a folder similar to the one she'd left at his apartment, but with more detailed information. "The position comes with full health insurance, medical, dental, vision," she said, going through the benefits package. 2 weeks paid vacation the first year, increasing to 4 weeks after 5 years, 401 with company matching. Educational assistance if you want to pursue additional training or certification. Marcus stared at the papers, trying to process the concept of paid vacation. He hadn't taken a day off in 2 years, partly because he couldn't afford to lose the income, and partly because his current employer treated sick days like personal failures. "What's the catch?" he asked. Elena looked up from the folder. "What do you mean?" "Nobody offers this kind of package to someone with my background. There has to be a catch." Elena set down the papers and leaned back in her chair. "The catch is that I need someone I can trust completely. This position has access to inventory worth millions of dollars. You'll know our suppliers, our profit margins, our operational weaknesses. You'll have the ability to impact our relationships with major clients. I can't hire someone just because they have the right credentials on paper. So why me? Because character matters more than credentials. Because you've already proven that you'll do the right thing even when it costs you something." Because I've built this company on the principle that good people make good employees, and you're good people. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest. The voice that sounded like Linda telling him he was fooling himself if he thought he deserved this kind of opportunity. What if I'm not good at it? What if I can't handle the responsibility? Then we'll figure it out together, Elena said simply. Marcus, I'm not offering you this job as charity. I'm offering it because I believe you can excel at it. But even if there's a learning curve, even if you make mistakes, we'll work through it. That's what good employers do. They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the warehouse operation drifting through the office windows. Marcus watched workers moving with purpose and efficiency, and he tried to imagine himself as part of this world, as someone with an office and responsibilities and a salary that would let him sleep at night without calculating grocery money. I need to think about it, he said finally. Of course, this is a big decision. Elena closed the folder and handed it to him. Take as much time as you need. Talk it over with Emma. The position will be here when you're ready. As they walked back toward the entrance, Elena seemed to be wrestling with something. Finally, she stopped near the lobby and turned to face him. Can I tell you something? She asked. Something personal? Marcus nodded. I grew up about 10 miles from here, in a neighborhood that makes yours look upscale. My mother cleaned office buildings at night and worked in a laundry during the day. I wore second-hand clothes that never quite fit right, and I learned to do homework by streetlight because our electricity got turned off so often. Elena's voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath it, the kind of strength that came from surviving things that should have broken her. When I was Emma's age, I remember being hungry so often that it became background noise, like tinnitus. Not dramatic, starving hungry, just empty, all the time. And I remember watching my mother work herself to death trying to keep us afloat, and I swore that I would never be that powerless again. Marcus found himself leaning forward, drawn in by the raw honesty in her voice. I started working when I was 13, cleaning offices with my mother on weekends, babysitting, anything I could find. I saved every penny for 4 years, and when I graduated high school, I used that money to buy a beat-up food truck. I sold breakfast burritos to construction workers and lunch to office employees, and I reinvested every dollar back into the business. Elena paused, looking out through the lobby windows at the parking lot where her black sedan sat next to Marcus's 15-year-old Honda. It took me 10 years to grow from that food truck to my first distribution contract. 10 years of 18-hour days and ramen noodle dinners and sleeping in the back of the truck to save money on rent. But I did it because I was terrified of going back to being powerless, of watching people I loved suffer because I wasn't strong enough to help them. She turned back to Marcus, and he saw something in her eyes that he recognized, the wariness of someone who had learned that the world didn't give away anything for free. But somewhere along the way, I forgot why I was doing it. I built this company, I made money, I gained influence, but I was so focused on never being vulnerable again that I stopped connecting with people. I stopped seeing the humanity in the struggle. Until the other night, Marcus said. Until the other night, Elena confirmed. When you gave me that soup, you reminded me what I'd lost. You reminded me that success without compassion is just sophisticated selfishness. Marcus felt something shift in his understanding of Elena, a recognition that her polished exterior covered scars that might be different from his, but were no less real. Why are you telling me this? He asked. Because I see the same fear in you that almost stopped me from taking the risks that changed my life. I see someone who's so afraid of failing that he won't let himself try to succeed. Elena's voice grew gentler. Marcus, you're not asking me for charity. You're not asking for anything. I'm offering you an opportunity because I believe you can excel at it, and because I need someone with your integrity working for me. What if Linda was right? The words came out before Marcus could stop them, and he immediately regretted the vulnerability they revealed. Who's Linda? Marcus closed his eyes, suddenly exhausted by the weight of carrying his ex-wife's judgment around like a stone in his pocket. Emma's mother, my ex-wife. She left 2 years ago, said I'd never amount to anything, that I was too small for anyone to love permanently. Elena was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was fierce with conviction. Linda was wrong, she said. Linda was a woman who couldn't see past her own limitations, so she projected them onto you. You're raising an extraordinary daughter on your own while working a job that barely pays enough to survive, and you're doing it with grace and dignity that most people never achieve. Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, some tightly held belief about his own worth that had been limiting his vision of what was possible. You gave away your last meal to help a stranger, Elena continued. You've built a life where your daughter feels safe and loved, despite having very little money. You've maintained your integrity in circumstances that would have broken lesser men. If that's not amounting to something, I don't know what is. The drive home took longer than usual because Marcus kept finding himself distracted by fragments of the conversation replaying in his head. Elena's words about Linda being wrong, about character mattering more than credentials, about the possibility that he was good enough for something better, they felt dangerous in their kindness, like hope wrapped in velvet that might cut him if he held it too tightly. Emma was waiting for him when he got home. Spread out on the living room floor with homework and art supplies scattered around her like the aftermath of a creative explosion. She looked up when he entered, her face bright with the unself-conscious joy that only children possessed. "Daddy, how was work?" "You're home early." Marcus sat down on the floor beside her, noting the careful way she'd organized her colored pencils by shade and the precise lettering on her spelling practice sheet. Work was different today. How was school? "Good. Mrs. Patterson said my science fair project idea was really creative. I want to test if plants grow better with music or without music. We have to pick our hypothesis and everything." Emma launched into a detailed explanation of the scientific method while Marcus half listened, his attention caught by the folder Elena had given him. It sat on the coffee table like a door to a different life, and he found himself alternating between wanting to open it again and wanting to hide it in a drawer where it couldn't tempt him with impossible possibilities. "Daddy, you're not listening," Emma said, her voice carrying the particular brand of 7-year-old indignation that came from being ignored during an important explanation. "I'm sorry, sweetheart." "Tell me again about your hypothesis." Emma repeated her explanation with the patient air of someone who was used to dealing with distracted adults. When she finished, she studied his face with the uncomfortable perceptiveness that children sometimes displayed. "Are you worried about something?" she asked. Marcus considered lying, but Emma had always been too smart for simple deceptions. "I'm thinking about making a change. A big change." "What kind of change?" Marcus picked up the folder and opened it, showing Emma the job description without going into details about salary or benefits. "The fancy lady offered me a job at her company." "A different job, with more responsibility." Emma read slowly, her lips moving silently as she worked through the bigger words. When she finished, she looked up at him with those dark eyes that saw too much. "It sounds important," she said. "It is important, maybe too important for someone like me." Emma frowned, the expression making her look older than her 7 years. "Someone like you?" Marcus struggled to explain his fears in terms a child could understand. "Someone who didn't go to college, someone who's only ever worked in warehouses, someone who might not be smart enough for an office job." Emma set down her colored pencil and turned to face him fully, her expression serious in a way that made Marcus's chest tighten. "Daddy, do you remember when I was scared to ride my bike without training wheels?" "Of course." "And you told me that being scared doesn't mean you can't do something, it just means it's important enough to be scary." Marcus felt his throat close slightly. "I remember." "Well, you're smart enough for anything," Emma continued with the absolute certainty that only children could possess. "You helped me with math homework that I can't figure out. You fixed Mrs. Chen's radio when nobody else could. You know how to do everything." "I don't know how to do everything, Em." "You know how to take care of me," she said simply. "That's the hardest thing of all." Marcus pulled his daughter into a hug, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and feeling the solid warmth of her small body against his chest. Emma had always been wise beyond her years, but sometimes her observations cut straight to the heart of things in ways that left him breathless. "Do you want me to take the new job?" he asked into her hair. Emma pulled back to look at him. "Do you want to take it?" "I'm scared to want it," Marcus admitted. "Because of what Mommy said?" The question hit Marcus like cold water. He'd thought he'd been careful not to let Emma hear Linda's final words, thought he'd protected her from the worst of their arguments, but children absorbed more than adults realized. And Emma had always been particularly good at reading the emotional undercurrents that adults tried to hide. "You heard that?" Emma nodded solemnly. "She was wrong, Daddy. You're not small. You're the biggest person I know." "I'm not very tall, kiddo." "Not big like tall," Emma said with the patient air of someone explaining something obvious. "Big like your heart is big. Like you make everything safer just by being there." Marcus felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. "When did you get so smart?" "I learned it from watching you," Emma said matter-of-factly. Then she picked up her colored pencil and returned to her artwork, as if she hadn't just delivered the most profound wisdom Marcus had heard in years. That night, after Emma had gone to bed, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with Elena's folder spread open in front of him. He read through the job description again, trying to match the requirements with his own experience. He looked at the salary figure, still barely believing that someone would pay him that much money for work he felt capable of doing. But more than the technical requirements or the financial benefits, Marcus found himself thinking about Elena's story, about the fear that had almost prevented her from taking the risks that had changed her life. He thought about Emma's absolute faith in his capabilities, about the way she'd compared his fear to her own experience learning to ride a bike. Maybe being scared doesn't mean you can't do something. Maybe it just means it's important enough to be scary. Marcus picked up his phone and stared at Elena's number for a long time before finally typing a text message. "I'd like to accept the position. When can we discuss start dates and transition details?" He sent the message before he could second-guess himself, then sat back and waited for the fear to overwhelm him. But instead of panic, he felt something lighter, not relief exactly, but the cautious optimism that came from taking a step towards something better instead of away from something worse. Elena's response came within minutes. "Wonderful. Are you free for breakfast tomorrow? We can discuss all the details and begin the transition process. And Marcus, congratulations. This is the beginning of something great." Marcus read the message twice, then closed the folder and went to check on Emma one more time before bed. She was sleeping peacefully, her dark hair spread across the pillow, and her stuffed elephant clutched tightly to her chest. In the dim light from the hallway, she looked impossibly young and innocent. And Marcus felt the familiar surge of fierce protectiveness that had driven every decision he'd made since becoming a single parent. He was taking this job for Emma, but also for himself. For the man he could become when he stopped being afraid of his own potential. For the future they could build together when survival was no longer the only goal. As Marcus finally settled into his own bed, he thought about Elena's words about character mattering more than credentials. He thought about Emma's faith in his abilities. He thought about the possibility that Linda had been wrong, that he wasn't destined for a small life in a small world with small dreams. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears, new opportunities to prove himself worthy of the trust Elena was placing in him. But tonight, for the first time in years, Marcus Chen fell asleep, thinking about possibilities instead of problems, about growing instead of just surviving, about the kind of man he wanted his daughter to see when she looked at her father. It was a dangerous kind of hope, the kind that could break your heart if it didn't come true. But it was also the kind that could change everything if you were brave enough to let it. The alarm clock's shrill cry at 6:30 a.m. felt different than it had for the past 5 years. Instead of the familiar dread that came with facing another day of scanning barcodes and moving boxes under Patterson's perpetual scowl, Marcus felt something he couldn't quite name, a nervous energy mixed with anticipation, like standing at the edge of a diving board and knowing there was no going back. He'd barely slept. Every time he'd closed his eyes, his mind had churned through possibilities and catastrophes in equal measure. What if he couldn't learn the computer systems? What if the other employees resented him for getting a position without climbing the traditional corporate ladder? What if Elena realized she'd made a mistake and regretted her offer before his first week was over? But underneath the anxiety, there was something else. A flutter of excitement that he hadn't felt since Emma had taken her first steps. That sense of witnessing something important beginning. Emma was already awake when he knocked on her bedroom door, sitting up in bed with her hair in wild tangles and her stuffed elephant pressed against her chest. She looked at him with eyes that were bright despite the early hour, and Marcus realized she'd probably slept as poorly as he had, though for different reasons. "Is today the day, Daddy?" she asked, her voice still thick with sleep. "Today's the day," Marcus confirmed, sitting on the edge of her bed. "My first day at the new job." Emma nodded solemnly as if she understood the weight of the moment. "Are you still scared?" Marcus considered lying, but Emma had always been too perceptive for easy deceptions. "Yeah, I'm still scared, but you know what you told me about being brave? That being scared doesn't mean you can't do something?" "That's right. It just means it's important enough to be scary." Emma scrambled out of bed and wrapped her arms around his neck in a fierce hug that smelled like strawberry shampoo and childhood. "You're going to be the best whatever, your job, is person they ever had," she whispered against his shoulder. "Logistics coordinator," Marcus said, his voice muffled by her hair. "You're going to be the best logistics coordinator ever," Emma corrected with the absolute certainty that only 7-year-olds could possess. Getting ready took longer than usual because Marcus had spent the previous evening shopping for work clothes with the advance Elena had insisted on giving him. The mall had been a foreign landscape of department stores and price tags that made him wince, but he'd managed to find 2 pairs of dress pants, 3 button-down shirts, and a navy blue tie that the saleswoman had assured him was appropriate for office work. Standing in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting the tie for the 4th time, Marcus barely recognized himself. The man looking back at him had the same face, the same calloused hands, the same worry lines around his eyes. But the clothes transformed him into someone who might belong in a glass office, someone who might be trusted with inventory worth millions of dollars. Emma appeared in the doorway, now dressed for school, in her favorite purple sweater and the jeans with the patches she'd decorated with fabric markers. She studied him critically, her head tilted to one side. "You look fancy," she announced, "like someone important." "I'm the same person I was yesterday," Marcus said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "I know," Emma replied. "But now, everyone else will know it too." The Rodriguez Holdings building looked even more impressive in the morning light than it had during his afternoon tour. The glass and steel facade reflected the sunrise, and the parking lot was already half full of cars that cost more than Marcus had made in his best year at the warehouse. He sat in his Honda for a moment, watching well-dressed people stride purposefully toward the entrance, and fought the urge to start the engine and drive straight back to the familiar discomfort of his old job. Elena was waiting for him in the lobby, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than his monthly rent, but somehow didn't make her seem untouchable. She smiled when she saw him, and Marcus was surprised to see what looked like genuine relief in her expression. "You came," she said, extending her hand for a firm handshake. "Did you think I wouldn't?" "I thought you might talk yourself out of it," Elena admitted. "I'm glad you didn't." She led him through the lobby toward the elevator bank, past the same photographs of community involvement he'd noticed during his tour. But this time, Marcus looked at them differently, not as corporate propaganda, but as evidence of the kind of company he was now part of. "How did you sleep?" Elena asked as they waited for the elevator. "I didn't, really." "Good. If you'd slept well, I would have worried that you didn't understand the significance of what you're taking on." The elevator carried them to the 3rd floor, where the administrative offices were located. The hallway was carpeted in a deep blue that muffled footsteps, and the walls were lined with framed photographs of the company's history. Elena, with her original food truck, the first distribution center, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, employee recognition events. "Your office is down here," Elena said, leading him past several closed doors with nameplates that read like a corporate directory. Human resources, accounting, operations management. They stopped at a door near the end of the hall, and Elena produced a key from her pocket. "This is yours," she said, handing him the key. "Your nameplate should be installed by this afternoon." Marcus unlocked the door and stepped inside, still amazed by the concept of having an office at all. The space was exactly as he remembered, small but well appointed, with a window overlooking the warehouse floor and furniture that looked like it had been selected by someone who understood that people had to spend 8 hours a day in this room. On the desk was a stack of folders, a new computer that hummed quietly, and a coffee mug with the Rodriguez Holdings logo. Beside the computer was a framed photograph that made Marcus's breath catch. It was Emma, sitting at their kitchen table with her homework spread around her, smiling at the camera with the gap-toothed grin that never failed to make his chest warm with love. "I hope you don't mind," Elena said, noticing his expression. "You mentioned that you kept a picture of her at your old job, and I thought you might want one here too." Marcus picked up the frame, running his thumb along the edge. "When did you take this?" "I didn't. I asked Mrs. Chen if she had any recent photos of Emma, and she let me make a copy of this one. She said it was her favorite because Emma looks so focused and happy." The thoughtfulness of the gesture hit Marcus harder than he'd expected. In his 5 years at the warehouse, his supervisors had never learned Emma's name, much less cared enough to ensure he had a photograph of her in his workspace. "Thank you," he said, setting the frame carefully on the desk where he could see it while he worked. "There's a lot to learn," Elena said, settling into one of the chairs across from his desk. "But we're going to take it one step at a time. Carmen will be your direct supervisor, and she's excellent at bringing new people up to speed without overwhelming them." As if summoned by her name, Carmen Delgado appeared in the doorway, carrying a steaming coffee cup and wearing the kind of smile that made instant allies. "Ready for your first day?" she asked, stepping into the office. "Fair warning, I believe in throwing people into the deep end, but I also believe in making sure they know how to swim first. For the next 2 hours, Carmen walked Marcus through the computer systems that would become his daily tools. She showed him the inventory management software, the shipping coordination programs, the quality control databases. The technology was more sophisticated than anything he'd used at the warehouse, but the underlying concepts were familiar: tracking products, managing schedules, ensuring that the right items reached the right destinations at the right times. "You picked this up quickly," Carmen observed as Marcus successfully processed a mock shipment through the system. "Most people take weeks to get comfortable with the software." "The logic is the same as what I was doing before," Marcus replied, navigating through the screens with growing confidence. "Just more detailed." "Exactly. And that's why Elena thought you'd be good at this. You understand the fundamentals, and you can see how all the pieces fit together." Around 10 a.m., Carmen led Marcus onto the warehouse floor for what she called the real education. They moved through the facility systematically, with Carmen explaining the flow of operations from receiving to shipping. Marcus watched workers scanning barcodes, operating forklifts, coordinating with drivers, and he recognized the same fundamental processes he'd been part of for 5 years, just executed with better systems and clearer communication. "The key to this job," Carmen explained as they stood near the receiving dock, "is understanding that every decision you make affects real people. When you coordinate a shipment, you're not just moving numbers around in a computer. You're making sure that restaurants can serve their customers, that grocery stores can stock their shelves, that families can put food on their tables." Marcus nodded, watching a driver back his 18-wheeler up to the loading dock with practiced precision. "At my old job, we never really thought about where the products were going. We just moved them from point A to point B." "That's the difference between a job and a career," Carmen said. "In a job, you do the tasks you're assigned. In a career, you understand how your work fits into something bigger." They spent the rest of the morning observing different aspects of the operation. Marcus met drivers who had been with the company for years, warehouse workers who spoke about their jobs with genuine pride, supervisors who treated their teams with respect rather than suspicion. It was like seeing a parallel universe version of his old workplace own, where people mattered as much as productivity. Lunch was in the company cafeteria, a bright space with windows and actual food rather than vending machines. Carmen introduced Marcus to several other employees, and he was struck by how readily they accepted him as a colleague. No one seemed surprised that Elena had hired someone from outside the company, and no one treated him like an outsider who needed to prove himself worthy of their respect. "Elena's got good instincts about people," said James, a purchasing coordinator who had started as a delivery driver 8 years earlier. "If she thinks you can handle the job, you can handle the job. Plus," added Sarah, a woman from the accounting department, "she's not exactly known for making impulsive decisions. If you're here, it's because she's thought it through carefully." The afternoon brought Marcus's first real challenge, a crisis involving a delayed shipment of fresh produce that threatened to disrupt deliveries to 12 restaurants across the city. Carmen brought him into the conference room where she was coordinating the response, and Marcus found himself in the middle of a rapid-fire discussion involving drivers, warehouse supervisors, and client representatives. The organic farm had equipment problems, Carmen explained, pointing to a whiteboard covered with delivery schedules and route maps. "Their shipment is running 6 hours behind, which means we need to completely reorganize our delivery schedule for tomorrow." Marcus listened to the discussion, watching Carmen orchestrate solutions with the calm efficiency of someone who had managed similar crises many times before. But as the conversation continued, he began to see patterns that others might have missed: ways to consolidate routes, opportunities to shift lower priority deliveries to accommodate the urgent shipments. "What if we combined the downtown routes?" he suggested during a brief lull in the conversation. "Routes 7 and 9 have some overlap, and if we adjusted the timing, we could free up capacity for the fresh produce deliveries." The room fell quiet for a moment, and Marcus felt his cheeks flush with heat. He'd overstepped, offered opinions when he should have been observing, acted like he belonged in strategic discussions when he'd been on the job for less than 8 hours. But Carmen was studying the route map with renewed interest, tracing delivery paths with her finger. "That could work," she said slowly. "It would mean longer days for 2 of our drivers, but we could offer overtime compensation, and it would solve the capacity problem." 20 minutes later, they had a solution that satisfied everyone. The restaurants would get their produce deliveries on schedule, the drivers would earn overtime pay, and the company would maintain its reputation for reliability. And Marcus had contributed meaningfully to the solution. "Good thinking," Carmen said as the meeting broke up. "You see connections that other people miss. That's exactly what this job requires." The rest of the week passed in a blur of training sessions, system tutorials, and gradual immersion into the rhythm of the company. Marcus arrived early and stayed late, not because anyone required it, but because he wanted to absorb as much as possible before his beginner's luck ran out. Elena checked on his progress daily, but she did it subtly, stopping by his office to ask how he was settling in, inviting him to join strategic meetings as an observer, introducing him to clients and vendors with the kind of casual confidence that made his presence seem natural rather than experimental. "How are you feeling about everything?" she asked at the end of his first week, settling into the chair across from his desk with a cup of coffee. "Overwhelmed," Marcus admitted. "But good, overwhelmed, if that makes sense." "It makes perfect sense. What's the hardest part?" Marcus considered the question, thinking about the challenges of learning new systems, building relationships with colleagues, and adjusting to an environment where his opinions were valued rather than merely tolerated. "Believing that I belong here," he said finally. "Every day I expect someone to realize that I'm just a warehouse worker pretending to be something else." Elena was quiet for a moment, studying his face with the same careful attention she'd shown that first night outside the pharmacy. "Marcus, can I tell you something that might help?" He nodded. "I've been running this company for 12 years, and I've hired dozens of people for positions at every level. Some of them came with impressive degrees and perfect resumes. Some of them were recommended by influential contacts. Some of them interviewed beautifully and said all the right things." Elena paused, taking a sip of her coffee. "Do you know what I've learned about predicting success?" "What?" "Credentials tell you what someone has done. Character tells you what they will do. And you, Marcus Chen, have more character in your little finger than most people develop in a lifetime. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, some tightly held belief about his own limitations beginning to loosen its grip. "You're not pretending to be something else," Elena continued. "You're becoming who you were always capable of being. The only difference is that now you're in an environment that recognizes and rewards your capabilities." That weekend, Marcus took Emma out for breakfast at a diner near their apartment, not because they had money to spare, but because he wanted to celebrate making it through his first week without any major disasters. They sat in a booth with cracked vinyl seats and shared pancakes, while Emma peppered him with questions about his new job. "Do you have your own office?" she asked, cutting her pancakes into precise squares before dousing them with syrup. "I do, with a window and everything." "Do you get to tell people what to do?" Marcus laughed. "Not exactly. I coordinate things, which means I help people figure out how to work together." "That sounds important," Emma said seriously. "Like being the conductor of an orchestra." The comparison was more accurate than she realized, and Marcus found himself thinking about it as they walked home through their neighborhood. He was learning to orchestrate the movement of products and people, to identify when different parts of the operation were out of sync, to conduct solutions that kept the whole system flowing smoothly. As winter turned to spring, Marcus settled into his role with growing confidence. He developed relationships with drivers and warehouse staff, learned to anticipate problems before they became crises, and began proposing improvements to existing processes. His suggestions were not only welcomed but implemented, and he started to see the direct impact of his work on the company's efficiency and profitability. The transformation wasn't just professional. With a stable income and health insurance, Marcus could afford to take Emma to the doctor for regular checkups rather than waiting until she was sick. He could buy groceries without calculating every item, replace Emma's outgrown clothes without checking the clearance racks first, and even start a small savings account for her college education. But more than the financial security, Marcus felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from his warehouse job. He was solving problems, contributing to something larger than himself, using his mind as well as his hands. He came home from work tired but satisfied rather than exhausted and defeated. The promotion came 6 months after he'd started, during a staff meeting where Elena announced the company's expansion into regional distribution. They were opening 2 new facilities, one in a neighboring state and another 3 hours north, and they needed someone to coordinate logistics across all 3 locations. "I'm pleased to announce that Marcus Chen will be taking on the role of Regional Logistics Manager," Elena said, and Marcus felt the room's attention focus on him like a spotlight. He's demonstrated exceptional ability to see the big picture while managing critical details, and he has the trust and respect of everyone he's worked with. The applause that followed felt surreal, like something happening to someone else. Marcus looked around the conference room at faces that had become familiar: Carmen, James, Sarah, Elena herself, and realized that he was no longer the outsider trying to prove himself worthy of their acceptance. He had become part of this community, a valued member of a team that respected his contributions. After the meeting, Elena asked him to stay behind. When the room had emptied, she pulled out a folder that looked familiar, the same type she'd used to present his original job offer. "This comes with a significant salary increase," she said, sliding the folder across the table. "It also comes with additional responsibilities, travel requirements, and the authority to make decisions that affect the entire company." Marcus opened the folder and stared at the numbers. The salary was more than he'd ever imagined earning, enough to move Emma to a better school district, to buy a reliable car, to think about a future beyond mere survival. "I don't know what to say," he managed. "Say you'll take it," Elena replied with a smile. "Say you'll trust yourself enough to accept that you've earned this. What if I'm not ready?" "Marcus, 6 months ago you gave away your last meal to help a stranger. Now you're coordinating logistics for a multi-million-dollar company and proposing solutions that increase our efficiency by double-digit percentages. If that's not ready, I don't know what is." Marcus thought about Emma, about the life he could provide for her with this opportunity. He thought about Linda's words, about never amounting to anything, about being too small for anyone to love permanently. He thought about Elena's story, about the fear that had almost prevented her from taking the risks that changed her life. "I'll take it," he said. And this time the words came without hesitation. The apartment that Marcus and Emma moved into that fall was in a different neighborhood, entirely one with tree-lined streets and well-maintained buildings, where children rode bicycles on sidewalks, and parents didn't have to worry about what lurked in dark corners after sunset. It had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with appliances that worked without coaxing, and windows that let in enough light to read by during the day. Emma had chosen her own room for the first time in her life, painting the walls a shade of blue that reminded Marcus of summer skies. She'd decorated it with books, art supplies, and a science fair trophy she'd won for her experiment with plants and music. The project had grown beyond her original hypothesis, just like everything else in their lives. The dinner party had been Emma's idea, though Marcus suspected Elena had somehow planted the suggestion during one of their weekly phone calls. Emma had been asking about Elena for months, wondering when they would see their friend again, insisting that they should invite her over to see their new home. "She helped us when we needed help?" Emma had argued with the irrefutable logic of an 8-year-old. Now we should help her by making her dinner. Marcus had protested that Elena probably had more sophisticated dinner invitations than anything they could offer, but Emma had been adamant. And when he'd finally worked up the courage to call Elena and extend the invitation, she'd accepted with an enthusiasm that suggested she'd been hoping for exactly this kind of gesture. Now Elena sat at their kitchen tabla, real dining table, not the wobbly coffee table that had served as their eating surface for years, while Emma put the finishing touches on a meal she'd insisted on preparing herself. Spaghetti with marinara sauce, garlic bread, and a salad that Emma had arranged with the careful precision of an artist. "This smells incredible," Elena said, accepting the plate that Emma handed her with the solemnity of someone performing an important ceremony. "I made the sauce myself," Emma announced proudly. "From a jar, but I added extra herbs and stuff." Marcus watched the interaction with a warmth that had nothing to do with the food or the apartment's efficient heating system. Elena was the same person who had sat shivering outside the pharmacy that snowy night, the same CEO who had offered him a chance at a different life. But she was also simply Emma's friend Elena, someone who complimented the salad dressing and asked for seconds on the garlic bread and listened with genuine interest to Emma's detailed explanation of her latest science project. "How's the new position treating you?" Elena asked Marcus as they cleared the dinner dishes. "It's challenging," Marcus admitted. "Managing 3 facilities instead of 1 means more complexity, more travel, more decisions that affect more people, but I love it." "And Emma's adjusting well to the new school?" "Better than I hoped. Her teacher says she's academically gifted, which means she gets to participate in accelerated programs. She's taking a computer programming class that's usually reserved for middle school students." Elena smiled, watching Emma organize the leftover garlic bread with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. "She gets that from you, you know. That ability to see how systems work, to understand how pieces fit together. I think she gets that from herself," Marcus replied. "I just try to give her room to grow into whoever she's supposed to become." As the evening wound down, Elena helped with the dishes while Emma showed off her room and her extensive collection of library books. The conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from work challenges to Emma's latest obsession with astronomy to Elena's plans for expanding the company's community outreach programs. "I should probably head home," Elena said finally, glancing at the clock on the microwave. "Early meeting tomorrow." "Thank you for coming," Marcus said, walking her to the door. "Emma's been looking forward to this for weeks." "So have I," Elena replied, pulling on her coat. "This is exactly what I needed, a reminder of why all the rest of it matters." Emma appeared at Marcus's side, still in her pajamas and ready for her bedtime story. "Elena, will you come back soon?" "I'd love to," Elena said, kneeling down to Emma's eye level. "Maybe next time you can teach me how to make that garlic bread. I've never been much of a cook." "I'll teach you everything," Emma promised with the generous confidence of someone who had never doubted her ability to share knowledge with those who needed it. After Elena left, Marcus tucked Emma into her new bed in her new room, reading her a chapter from a book about a girl who became an astronaut. As Emma drifted off to sleep, Marcus sat beside her for a moment, looking around the room that she'd made her own with books and drawings and the kind of confident decoration that came from feeling secure enough to claim space as your own. In the living room, Marcus settled onto the couch, a real couch, bought new rather than inherited from someone else's life, and thought about the path that had led them here. A year ago, he'd been a warehouse worker struggling to pay rent, giving away his last meal to a stranger because it was the right thing to do. Now he was a regional manager, living in a neighborhood where Emma could walk to school safely, where she could dream about becoming anything she wanted without worrying about whether they could afford those dreams. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, days when he'd felt overwhelmed by responsibilities he wasn't sure he could handle, nights when Linda's voice had whispered that he was fooling himself if he thought he deserved this kind of success. But Emma had been right about being brave enough to let good things happen, and Elena had been right about character mattering more than credentials. Most importantly, Marcus had learned to trust his own capabilities, to believe that the man who had raised Emma with love and integrity was the same man who could excel in a corporate environment without compromising the values that defined him. His phone buzzed with a text message from Elena. "Thank you for tonight. Dinner was perfect, and Emma is remarkable. See you Monday for the quarterly review meeting." Marcus typed back. "Thank you for everything, for the job, for the opportunity, for believing in us before we believed in ourselves." Elena's response came quickly. "Thank you for reminding me that kindness is still the most important currency in the world." Marcus set his phone aside and looked around the apartment that had become their home. Emma's artwork decorated the refrigerator, her books filled the shelves they'd bought together, her laughter had already made these rooms feel lived in rather than simply occupied. This was what success looked like, not just financial stability or professional recognition, but the ability to provide security and opportunity for the person who mattered most. Outside, snow was beginning to fall again, the same kind of wet, heavy flakes that had been falling the night he'd met Elena. But this time, Marcus wasn't walking through the cold worried about how to stretch groceries until payday. This time, he was warm and safe and surrounded by evidence of how much could change when you were brave enough to accept help and smart enough to work hard once you got it. He thought about Elena's story, about climbing from poverty to success through determination and calculated risks. He thought about Emma's wisdom, about the difference between being scared and being unable. He thought about the choices that had brought them to this momentous decision to help a stranger, Elena's decision to offer him an opportunity, his decision to trust that he was worthy of something better. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, meetings to run, problems to solve, decisions that would affect dozens of employees and thousands of customers. But tonight, Marcus Chen sat in his own living room in his own home, listening to his daughter sleep safely in her own bed, and marveled at how much could change when kindness met opportunity and courage met the willingness to grow. The last bowl of soup he'd given away had been replaced by abundance he'd never imagined possible. But more than the material improvements, Marcus had discovered something invaluable, the knowledge that character really did matter more than circumstances, that integrity really could be rewarded, and that sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, the world gave back more than you ever thought to ask for. As he finally headed to bed, Marcus paused at Emma's doorway to check on her one more time. She was sleeping peacefully, her arm wrapped around her stuffed elephant, her face relaxed in the perfect contentment that came from feeling completely secure. Tomorrow, she would wake up in a house where the heat worked reliably, where the refrigerator was always full, where her father had a job that challenged and fulfilled him, rather than simply paying the bills. But more importantly, she would wake up knowing that she was loved by a father who had learned that accepting help didn't make him weak, that success didn't require abandoning his values, and that kindness, 7, when it cost him everything, had been the investment that changed their lives forever. Marcus closed Emma's door softly and went to his own room, where he fell asleep, thinking not about what they'd lost or what they'd lacked, but about what they'd found. a community that valued them, a future full of possibilities, and the unshakable knowledge that sometimes the most important thing you can do is help a stranger in the snow, because you never know when that stranger might turn out to be the person who helps you discover who you were always meant to become.